The chandeliers at the Plaza Hotel glittered like frozen thunder, catching every flash from the cameras as Manhattan's elite filled the ballroom. Adrian Cole, CEO of Cole Dynamics, entered with a calm smile that had been trained to impress investors. On his arm was Sophie Lang, his 25-year-old secretary, dressed in a shimmering silver gown that whispered scandal louder than champagne ever could. Reporters turned, lenses clicking. "Mr. Cole, your wife couldn't make it tonight," one called out. Adrian tightened his jaw, pretending not to hear. Sophie squeezed his arm like a claim. He looked every bit the conqueror. Custom Dior tuxedo, Rolex gleaming beneath the sleeve, the confidence of a man who thought he had rewritten the rules. But arrogance can't predict timing. Because at that very second, the doors of the ballroom opened again. Grace Sinclair, Adrian's wife, entered. Her father, Robert Sinclair, the reclusive billionaire behind Sinclair Capital, walked beside her, his presence cutting through the room like a boardroom verdict. Conversations died mid-sentence. Grace's dress was a quiet storm. Navy silk, no sparkle, but power in every step. She looked calm, almost too calm, like someone who had rehearsed this moment 1,000 times. Sophie's hand slipped from Adrian's arm. He froze, smile collapsing as the photographers turned. "Mrs. Cole," someone shouted. Grace smiled faintly, her eyes not on Adrian, but on the Tiffany box she carried. Robert nodded toward the stage, expression unreadable. He had just funded Cole Dynamics' upcoming expansion. Something Adrian didn't know yet was under review. When Grace reached the front, the master of ceremonies made the mistake of saying, "And tonight, we welcome Mr. Cole and his lovely partner." The silence that followed wasn't awkward. It was surgical. Grace stepped forward, placing the small Tiffany box on the podium. "I believe this belongs to someone else," she said softly, voice clear through the microphone. "And as for being a partner, perhaps that definition should be clarified." Adrian's smile broke completely. The cameras zoomed in, one click, two, and the headlines wrote themselves. Robert Sinclair rested a hand on his daughter's shoulder. "Let's give them a real introduction," he murmured. Grace turned to the crowd. "Good evening," she began, steady and deliberate. "I'm Grace Sinclair Cole, and I'm here to thank the people who reminded me that silence protects no one." The room held its breath. Even the music dared not play. Adrian reached for the microphone, but Robert's gaze, ice and authority, stopped him cold. Grace looked directly at her husband, her tone cutting through the air like glass. "Some partnerships," she said, "end the moment truth walks in the door." And just like that, the empire he built on lies began to crack, one chandelier reflection at a time. The morning of the gala began like any other in the Cole penthouse overlooking Central Park. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, warming the marble floor. Grace Cole sat at the breakfast counter, stirring her coffee slowly, eyes unfocused. On her iPhone, a notification blinked, an email receipt from the Ritz-Carlton. Her thumb hovered over it. When she opened it, the charge was for a 2-night executive suite. The name on the booking, Sophie Lang. Her pulse froze. Grace looked across the kitchen, where Adrian adjusted his cufflinks, humming. "Did you stay at the Ritz again?" she asked softly. He didn't even look up. Client meetings ran late. Sophie handled the logistics. Grace studied him for a moment. "You trust her a lot, don't you?" Adrian chuckled without warmth. "She delivers results, Grace. Something you might remember from when you actually worked." The words landed like a slap. He reached for his Mont Blanc pen, signed a few documents, then kissed her forehead without looking. "Wear something elegant tonight. I don't want to deal with drama." When he left, the silence he left behind screamed louder than any argument. Grace placed the phone down, her reflection trembling in the black screen. She wasn't the same woman who once built the PR department from scratch. She'd stepped back to prepare for her MBA at Columbia, something Adrian had convinced her to postpone for the sake of the company. That sacrifice, once made out of love, now felt like a chain. Her best friend and lawyer, Nora Patel, called. "You sound off," Nora said immediately. Grace told her about the receipt. Nora sighed. "Grace, listen to me carefully. Don't confront him yet. Tonight's event is going to be crawling with investors and press. If he's bold enough to bring her there, he'll expose himself. Let the truth do the talking." Grace's throat tightened. "You think he'll really bring her?" "I think you already know the answer." For the rest of the day, Grace moved like a ghost. She walked into her closet, her fingers brushing past shimmering dresses that suddenly felt meaningless. Then, she saw it. The navy silk gown her mother once wore to a state dinner at the plaza. Simple, understated, but dignified. She laid it on the bed. By evening, as her father's black Mercedes S-Class waited outside, Grace stood before the mirror. She looked composed, but hollow. Her Tiffany wedding ring caught the last light of sunset, and for the first time she wondered if love had ever been part of this marriage, or if she'd been a prop in his performance of success. Robert Sinclair appeared at the door. "Ready?" he asked, voice calm but sharp as the man who built empires. Grace turned, clutching a small Tiffany box in her hand. "I'm not going to make a scene," she whispered. "I just want him to see that I know." Robert's gaze softened for a rare moment, then let him see. As the car glided down Fifth Avenue toward the plaza, Grace's mind replayed every compromise she'd ever made for Adrian. Every dinner canceled, every promise postponed, every time she had swallowed her pride for his ambition. The lights of Manhattan blurred outside the window, golden and cruel. When they arrived, Grace exhaled. She felt her pulse steady, her fear fade. Tonight, she wasn't the quiet wife behind the CEO. She was the woman who built the empire beside him, and the one who could end it. And as she stepped out under the plaza's golden awning, she knew, before the first toast, the first crack had already begun. The plaza's ballroom glittered with wealth, crystal chandeliers, gold trim, laughter echoing like champagne bubbles. But inside a smaller private suite upstairs, a very different kind of gathering was taking place. Robert Sinclair sat at a round oak table, his MacBook Pro open, eyes fixed on a stream of financial data. Grace stood near the window, her reflection ghosted against the Manhattan skyline. "Adrian doesn't know I'm here, does he?" she asked quietly. Robert didn't look up. "He'll know soon enough." On the screen, stock projections and internal HR reports scrolled in neat, merciless lines. Ethan Rise, Cole Dynamics CFO, leaned forward, his expression tight. "Mr. Sinclair, I've analyzed the audit trail. The company's performance metrics are inflated by at least 12%. They're manipulating retention numbers to hide staff burnout and complaints." Grace blinked. "Complaints?" Ethan nodded. "Anonymous submissions about long hours, verbal abuse, even inappropriate messages." His voice dropped. "From Adrian, mostly towards Sophie Lang." Robert's hand stilled on the keyboard. "You have evidence?" Ethan slid over a flash drive. "Everything. Emails, time logs, phone transcripts." Grace's heart hammered. For a moment, she felt dizzy. The betrayal wasn't just personal, it was professional, systemic. Adrian had built his empire on people's exhaustion and her silence. Robert finally looked at his daughter. "Grace, this is the nervous system of his company. Numbers, perception, control. Once it fails, the whole body collapses." Grace crossed her arms, voice trembling but steady. "Then we need to show what kind of body it really is." Robert leaned back, eyes narrowing with the precision of a man used to war in boardrooms. "We'll handle this quietly for now. I'll instruct Marcus Hale to monitor all communications. If Adrian slips tonight, we'll have proof before the market opens." Marcus, a tall man in a tailored black suit, entered without knocking. "Security perimeters tight, my team's covering all exits, press passes verified." He handed Grace a discreet earpiece. "You'll hear everything in real time if anything happens downstairs." Grace hesitated before taking it. "You really think it'll come to that?" Marcus's tone was calm. "Mrs. Cole, men who think they can't lose usually do," loudly. Robert gave a short nod of approval. "Grace, tonight isn't about revenge, it's about restoration. You've been patient long enough. Now it's time to use what he underestimated most, your composure." Grace drew a slow breath. Outside the window, the lights of Park Avenue shimmered like constellations on Earth. She watched limousines pull up one after another, bringing people who worshipped power as if it were religion. Downstairs, the gala was beginning. Adrian was probably already basking in applause, Sophie at his side pretending the world was his stage. Nora Patel's voice came through Grace's phone. "All set, legal team is on standby. If he does anything unethical tonight, we'll trigger the compliance clause in the loan agreement." Grace managed a small smile. "Thank you, Nora." Robert closed his laptop, the metallic click sharp in the still air. "We move when the truth shows its face, not before." Grace straightened her shoulders, her pulse slowing into rhythm. The fear that once paralyzed her had transformed into focus. Every heartbeat matched the ticking of the Mont Blanc pen Robert twirled between his fingers. For the first time in months, Grace felt control return to her hands, not through shouting, but through silence sharpened to a blade. And as the orchestra swelled downstairs, she knew, by midnight, the music of power would sound very different. The orchestra played a soft waltz as champagne glasses clinked beneath the chandeliers. Every camera in the ballroom turned toward the stage where Adrian Cole stood, polished and confident, his Rolex glinting each time he gestured. His smile looked effortless, rehearsed but effective. Sophie Lang hovered near the edge of the spotlight, smiling too brightly, her diamond earrings trembling with nerves. Adrian tapped the microphone. Ladies and gentlemen, tonight isn't just about business, it's about vision, partnership, and the future of Cole Dynamics. The audience applauded. His investors, seated at front tables adorned with white roses and gold silverware, leaned forward eagerly. Grace watched from the entrance, still hidden in the shadow of the marble archway. Robert Sinclair stood beside her, posture straight, hands clasped behind his back. "Wait for your moment," he murmured. Grace nodded, her eyes fixed on her husband. Adrian continued his speech, voice silky. "We've achieved record growth this quarter, and with our new funding." The doors opened. Grace stepped in. Every sound died. The orchestra faltered. The clink of glass stopped. The camera flashes returned like lightning. In her navy silk gown, Grace looked like a calm storm moving across a fragile sea of whispers. Adrian's voice caught. "Grace?" She didn't answer. Instead, she walked toward the stage, her heels clicking across the marble floor, each step echoing louder than applause. Behind her, Robert followed with measured authority, his expression unreadable. The MC blinked, uncertain. "Mrs. Cole, would you like to join your husband on stage?" Grace smiled faintly. "Thank you. I believe I have something to say." Without waiting for permission, she took the microphone from Adrian's hand. "Good evening," she began, her tone composed but resonant. "My husband just spoke about partnership and vision. I'd like to add something to that." Adrian forced a laugh. "Honey, maybe we can." Grace cut him off, her voice soft yet razor-sharp. "True partnership is built on trust. But when trust is replaced by deceit, what's left isn't partnership, it's performance." Murmurs rippled through the audience. Sophie shifted uncomfortably, eyes darting toward the exits. Grace held up a small Tiffany box, the same one from earlier. "This was supposed to be a gift," she said, opening it slowly. Inside, a pair of cufflinks gleamed under the spotlight. "But I realized you can't decorate betrayal and call it love." Gasps spread through the ballroom. Adrian reached for her arm, whispering, "Grace, not here." She met his gaze, calm but unflinching. "Exactly here. Because this is where you turned marriage into marketing." Robert stepped forward, his voice steady and low. "For those who don't know, Sinclair Capital has been in talks with Cole Dynamics for a major funding partnership. However, we believe that ethics and transparency must come before expansion." A hush fell over the crowd. Investors glanced at one another. Adrian's smile collapsed entirely. Grace handed the microphone back to the MC. "Please, continue the evening. I've said enough." But before the music could resume, one of the reporters shouted, "Mrs. Cole, are you confirming rumors about misconduct within Cole Dynamics?" Grace turned slightly, her expression unreadable. "I'm confirming that the truth always finds its audience." The cameras erupted again. Adrian tried to recover, but his voice shook. "Ladies and gentlemen, my wife is..." Robert placed a firm hand on his shoulder. "Careful, son. Every word is being recorded." Grace stepped off the stage, her chin lifted. She didn't look back. And as applause, half shocked, half awed, broke through the tension, Adrian realized the night he thought would make him a legend had just made him a lesson. A year before that glittering night at the plaza, Grace Cole had already begun to disappear, slowly, politely, invisibly. It started the morning she received the email from Columbia University. "Congratulations, you've been accepted to the MBA in Strategic Leadership." She'd read it twice, smiling through tears. It felt like a doorway opening. Then Adrian came home. He was on his phone, pacing across their penthouse living room, barking orders about quarterly reports. When he finally looked at her, his smile was thin. "What's that?" "My acceptance," she said softly. "Columbia." He blinked, distracted. "That's wonderful, Grace. But is now really the time? We're scaling the company fast, and it looks strange for the CEO's wife to walk away when the board's watching. Grace frowned. It's a 2-year program, Adrian. I can still help remotely. He slipped his arm around her shoulders, his tone warm but final. You don't need to prove anything. You already have everything. That was the day Grace's voice began to shrink. The Mont Blanc pen she'd bought to sign her admission papers stayed in its box, still wrapped in tissue. Every morning she'd see it on her desk beside her unopened Columbia folder, a quiet reminder of what she had given up to be supportive. Adrian would come home late, smelling like cologne and ambition. He'd toss his iPhone on the counter and talk about investors, strategy, Sophie's potential. Grace would listen, nod, refill his glass, and smile like she still mattered in his orbit. Nights grew longer, conversations shorter. The man who once called her his compass now treated her like an accessory, a symbol of stability, not a partner. She'd lie awake, staring at the Manhattan skyline outside their window, the city's lights mocking her stillness. One night, she found a Cartier box in his briefcase, a bracelet she had never received. When she asked about it, he brushed it off. A client gift. Don't overthink everything. She laughed weakly, pretending to believe him, because the truth hurt more than denial. The loneliness built slowly, like water behind glass. When Grace's mother passed away the following spring, Adrian sent flowers from the office but didn't attend the funeral. I had an investor call, he explained. You understand. She nodded, numb. It was Robert, her father, who noticed first. During dinner at the River Cafe, he watched his daughter pick at her food in silence. You're quieter than usual, he said gently. I'm fine, Dad. He reached across the table, his voice firm but tender. Grace, fine is what people say when they've given up. She looked away, tears burning her eyes. He just needs time. He's under pressure. Robert exhaled slowly. Pressure reveals character. It doesn't excuse it. That night, she sat on her balcony, clutching her mother's old watch, a vintage Rolex passed down through generations. Its steady ticking was the only sound in her empty apartment. Grace made a promise to herself. If Adrian ever publicly humiliated her, she would no longer protect him. She didn't yet know when or how, but she would reclaim the life she had paused. When the Ritz-Carlton receipt appeared in her inbox a year later, she didn't cry. She simply opened the drawer, took out the Mont Blanc pen still gleaming inside its case, and whispered, "Time's up." And from that moment on, the quiet wife began to write the loudest chapter of her life, without saying a single unnecessary word. The Gala had descended into whispers and half-frozen smiles. After Grace's stunning interruption, Adrian tried to recover by mingling, laughing too loudly, pretending nothing had happened. But beneath the glitter and champagne, panic rippled like static. Sophie Lang slipped away from the crowd, her silver gown trailing behind her as she headed toward the antechamber near the ballroom. Her hands trembled as she pulled out her phone. Messages from Adrian filled the screen. Half apologies, half orders. Stay calm. Don't talk to anyone. I'll handle it. She deleted them all. Then the door opened, and Grace stepped inside. For a moment, neither spoke. The hum of the ballroom faded into the distance, replaced by the low thrum of city traffic beyond the windows. Grace looked composed, the Tiffany box now gone, but her eyes, those calm, sharp eyes, held the weight of truth. Sit down, Sophie, she said gently. Sophie hesitated, then obeyed, perching on the velvet armchair like a guilty student. Mrs. Cole, I swear it's not what people think. Grace raised a hand, silencing her. I'm not here to shame you, Sophie blinked. You're not? Grace shook her head. You think he loves you? Sophie's lips parted. He said, he promised. Grace's voice softened, almost sympathetic. That you were special. That no one understood him the way you did. That he needed you. Tears filled Sophie's eyes. Yes. Grace took a step closer. He said the same things to me, right before convincing me to give up my MBA. The younger woman froze, her mascara smudged slightly as she whispered, He used me, didn't he? Grace didn't answer immediately. She reached into her clutch and pulled out a cream envelope. Inside is a non-disclosure support agreement, drafted by Nora Patel, my lawyer. It gives you legal protection if you're retaliated against after tonight. You'll have the freedom to testify or walk away without fear. Sophie looked stunned. You're helping me? Grace met her gaze. No. I'm helping every woman who thinks silence is loyalty. The words hit harder than anger could. Sophie's composure crumbled. She buried her face in her hands, sobbing quietly. Grace sat across from her. You're young. You made mistakes. But what you do next decides whether you stay a victim or become a witness. There was a long silence. Then Sophie looked up, eyes wet but steady. What do you want me to do? Tell the truth, Grace said simply. Not to me, to yourself. Then decide who deserves your loyalty. The ballroom's music swelled faintly through the walls. Adrian's laughter forced, hollow. Grace stood, smoothing her gown. Sophie whispered, He'll destroy me. Grace paused by the door. He already tried. The only difference is, I stopped letting him. As Grace left, Marcus Hale, Robert's head of security, passed her in the hallway. He gave her a subtle nod. He'd recorded the entire conversation through the earpiece she wore. Proof, compassion, and control, all in one move. Back inside, Sophie stared at the envelope on the table. Then, trembling, she picked it up. Downstairs, Adrian raised his glass to a group of investors, smiling wide enough to hide the tremor in his hand. But upstairs, two women had already rewritten the story he thought he owned, and the real press conference hadn't even begun. Midnight lights shimmered off the glass towers of Park Avenue, reflecting a city that never truly slept, especially not on a night like this. While the ballroom downstairs still pulsed with forced laughter, a quieter, colder meeting took place in a private suite 2 floors above. Robert Sinclair stood at the head of the mahogany conference table, sleeves rolled, demeanor calm but lethal. Beside him sat Ethan Reyes, the CFO of Cole Dynamics, scrolling through files on his iPad. The digital clock on the wall ticked toward 12:03 a.m. Grace entered silently, her heels barely making a sound on the Persian rug. Adrian's still mingling, she said, pretending nothing's happened. Robert nodded. Good. The longer he plays innocent, the deeper the fall. Ethan cleared his throat. Mr. Sinclair, I've confirmed the numbers. There's a problem with the ESG compliance data. If regulators see this, the funding deal collapses instantly. Grace frowned. He falsified reports? Not directly, Ethan said carefully. He told HR to reclassify burnout cases as temporary leaves. He also buried employee complaints under wellness initiatives. It looks ethical on paper, but it's a lie. Robert looked at Grace. That's the crack we need. He turned to Ethan. I want a formal hold on the disbursement. Notify the 3 lending banks to suspend the revolving credit line pending review. Ethan hesitated. That'll hit him hard. He'll know it's you. Robert smiled faintly. That's the point. Marcus Hale entered, closing the door behind him. Press is starting to pick up chatter from the ballroom. Adrian's PR team is spinning it as a marital misunderstanding. Should I release the footage of his private conversation with the secretary? Grace shook her head instantly. Not yet. Let him bury himself first. Robert studied her for a moment. You're learning quickly. Grace met his eyes. You taught me to play long games. For a brief second, the Iron Billionaire almost smiled. Ethan slid a laptop toward Grace. On the screen, projections danced in neat, glowing lines. Stock fluctuations, media impact, liquidity risk. If we freeze the credit line now, the stock will drop 5% by morning. 10% if the media connects it to misconduct. Grace looked at the data, her pulse steady. Then we'll freeze it, but not to destroy him, to expose him. I want the employees to know what kind of system they've been working under. Robert's expression softened with quiet pride. That's your mother in you. She never fought to humiliate, only to illuminate. Outside the windows, the city shimmered with indifferent beauty. Yellow taxis streamed below like veins of light. Grace placed her hand on the laptop trackpad, hovering over the send command for the freeze order. Grace, Ethan said quietly, once this goes out, there's no coming back. She looked out toward the skyline. I already left him long before tonight. This is just the paperwork. She clicked. The file transmitted. A tiny chime confirmed it. Simple, final, irreversible. Robert leaned back, exhaling. Now we wait. Grace walked to the window, gazing at the rows of offices still lit at midnight. She thought of all the people who'd sacrificed their health for a paycheck, who'd swallowed fear the same way she'd swallowed silence. Down below, Adrian toasted to his bright future, unaware that his company's heartbeat had just been paused. And as the city lights blinked against the night sky, Grace realized this wasn't revenge, it was surgery. The kind that saves what's worth keeping by cutting out the rot. The sun hadn't yet risen over Manhattan, but Adrian Cole was already awake, sitting in his penthouse office with a tumbler of whiskey half full and his Rolex blinking in the pale light. The gala was over, yet its ghost still echoed in his head. The cameras, the whispers, Grace's calm voice slicing through his pride like glass. He opened his MacBook, scrolling through the night's headlines. Coal Dynamics faces ethics probe. CEO's marriage crumbles during gala. He slammed the laptop shut, chest tightening. He'd spent his life constructing an image, polished, untouchable. He was the man who came from nothing, the orphan who built a company from a single apartment with a borrowed loan and a dream. He'd learned early that people respected control, not kindness. Control was what kept the wolves away. But now control was slipping. Adrian stood and walked toward the window. The Manhattan skyline stretched before him like a monument to ambition. Steel, glass, and lies held together by ego. For the first time, it didn't look like victory. It looked like a prison built from his own reflection. The intercom buzzed. "Sir," Sophie's voice trembled. "HR just called. The banks froze our credit line. Payroll's locked." Adrian's stomach dropped. "What?" "Something about ESG compliance and pending audit authorization. They said Sinclair Capital initiated it." He gripped the edge of his desk, knuckles white. "Grace," he hissed. She came by earlier," Sophie continued hesitantly. "She left an envelope for you." "Where is it?" "On your desk." He grabbed it. Inside, a single sheet of paper, Grace's handwriting, elegant and deliberate. "Control built on fear isn't leadership. It's dependency disguised as power. You taught me that lesson. Thank you." Beneath the note, his wedding ring. Adrian sank into his chair, the letter trembling in his hand. For the first time in years, he didn't know what move to make. Every strategy, every speech, every illusion of dominance felt suddenly childish. His phone rang. It was his COO. "Adrian, the media's everywhere. Investors want answers. Do you want me to release a statement?" "Not yet," Adrian muttered. "Buy time." The call ended, leaving only the hum of the city. He poured another drink, but it didn't calm him. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. He thought of Grace's eyes at the gala. Not angry, just done. That hurt more than rage ever could. He remembered their first apartment in Brooklyn, before the suits, before the empire. She'd brought home takeout from a corner deli, laughing when he stayed up all night working on his first pitch deck. Back then, she was his reason. Somewhere along the way, she became his reflection. A mirror he stopped looking into because it showed him the truth. He picked up his phone again, scrolling through his messages with Sophie. Sweet nothings, promises, lies. Each one looked smaller now, pathetic against the weight of what he'd lost. He stared out the window again, at Wall Street's cold towers in the distance. He'd once thought power meant never having to apologize. But in that moment, staring at his empty office, Adrian realized the truth. Power without respect was just noise. A knock came at the door. Marcus Hale stepped inside, uninvited but calm. "Mr. Cole, you might want to turn on the news." Adrian did. A live feed showed reporters outside Coal Dynamics headquarters. The headline scrolled, "Sinclair Capital demands leadership review." Adrian's jaw clenched. "So this is how she wants to play." Marcus studied him. "No, sir, this isn't a game anymore." And as the morning light finally broke through the glass towers, the man who thought he could control everything realized he'd never truly controlled himself. By the next evening, the ballroom at the plaza was no longer just a venue. It was a battlefield disguised in velvet and gold. The charity auction resumed, but every guest knew the air was heavier than before. The whispers had turned into theories, and theories into headlines. Grace arrived late, walking through the revolving doors with quiet purpose. The Tiffany blue evening lights shimmered across her navy gown, the same one she'd worn the night before. She wasn't hiding anymore. She was walking straight into the fire. Reporters swarmed instantly. "Mrs. Cole, is it true you filed for separation? Are the rumors about corporate misconduct accurate? Did Sinclair Capital freeze funding because of your husband?" She said nothing. She didn't need to. Silence had weight when worn with dignity. At the far end of the ballroom, Adrian stood under the chandeliers, pretending to chat with investors, though his smile looked strained, plastic. His Rolex glimmered, but his hands trembled slightly. Sophie wasn't there. She'd resigned that morning, leaving behind an HR statement and a copy of the non-disclosure support agreement Grace had given her. As Grace approached, cameras began flashing again. The master of ceremonies, clearly uncomfortable, announced the next item for auction. A limited edition Tiffany set, donated anonymously. Grace stepped forward. "Not anonymously," she said, her voice carrying over the hum of the room. All eyes turned. "I donated it," she continued calmly, "because tonight I'd like to auction something far more valuable than jewelry. A lesson in respect." Adrian froze. "Grace, stop this." She ignored him. "For years I believed success was measured by appearances, by luxury, by perception, by how loudly you could applaud yourself in public. But tonight, I've learned that respect, once lost, is harder to buy than any diamond." The crowd whispered, enthralled. Some raised their phones to record. Grace opened the small Tiffany box, revealing the cufflinks Adrian had once worn to every investor meeting. They gleamed under the spotlight like twin mirrors reflecting his downfall. "These belong to a man who once told me honesty was bad for business," she said softly. "I'd like to start the bidding at $1. A sharp gasp cut through the crowd. Adrian stepped closer, hissing under his breath, "You're humiliating me." Grace turned to face him, voice steady. "No, Adrian. I'm holding a mirror. What you see is your own reflection." Before he could respond, Robert Sinclair walked forward, microphone in hand. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said evenly, "Sinclair Capital has officially suspended its partnership with Coal Dynamics pending a full ethics investigation." The room erupted, half in shock, half in applause. The investors at the front exchanged panicked glances, phones lighting up with notifications. Adrian's face went pale. "Robert, this isn't the place," Robert cut him off coldly. "When deception happens in public, accountability should too." Grace closed the Tiffany box and placed it gently on the auction stand. "Don't worry," she said quietly, almost kindly. "I'm not here to destroy you, Adrian. I'm here to make sure you can't destroy anyone else." For a long moment, he just stood there, breathing heavily, cornered by truth. And then the applause began. It wasn't cruel, it wasn't mocking. It was slow, deliberate, an acknowledgement of courage. Grace bowed her head slightly, tears threatening but contained. As she turned away, the flash of cameras followed her like starlight. Adrian tried to speak, but his voice broke. "Grace." She didn't stop walking, and when the auctioneer lifted the Tiffany box to begin the bidding, everyone in the room knew. What was being sold wasn't jewelry, it was the last ounce of his reputation. By sunrise, the headlines had already spread across every screen in New York. Coal Dynamics under internal investigation. Sinclair Capital freezes funding amid Gala scandal. The story wasn't just gossip anymore, it was financial news. Markets listened when Robert Sinclair moved. In a sleek corner office overlooking Park Avenue, Nora Patel, Grace's longtime friend and legal counsel, stood before a wall of glass, phone pressed to her ear. "Yes," she said crisply, "effective immediately. Place a litigation hold on all Coal Dynamics communications, emails, texts, everything. No deletions." She hung up, exhaling, then looked over at Grace, who sat on the leather couch, still in her navy coat. Her face was calm, but her hands trembled slightly. "This is going to get ugly," Nora said quietly. Grace nodded. "It already was. Now it's just visible." Marcus Hale entered, carrying a sealed envelope. "We've secured the footage of Adrian's conversation with Sophie at the gala," he said. "She signed a statement confirming coercion and misrepresentation." Nora took the envelope. "That's solid evidence. Between that and the internal audits, he's cornered." Grace stared out the window, the city alive beneath the morning fog. "I never wanted to ruin him, Nora. I just wanted to stop pretending." "You didn't ruin him," Nora replied. "He built the ruin himself. You just turned on the lights." A soft knock interrupted them. Ethan Reyes, the CFO, stepped in, his face drawn. "I've just come from the boardroom," he said. "Adrian's calling an emergency meeting at 9. He's trying to rally the directors against the freeze." Robert Sinclair's voice echoed from the doorway. "Let him try." He entered the room, immaculate as ever, his Mont Blanc pen glinting in his breast pocket. "The board won't side with him once they see the evidence. But we'll give him the chance to speak. Every empire deserves its final meeting." Grace looked up. "What happens if he refuses to step down?" Robert's tone was clinical. "Then Sinclair Capital withdraws completely. The company will collapse within a week." Silence. The hum of the city filled the space between them. Grace pressed her palms together. "Then I want to be there, not to fight, but to watch him face the truth." At 9 sharp, The board assembled in the glass-walled conference room of Coal Dynamics. The skyline glittered behind them, beautiful and brutal. Adrian entered last, his once perfect posture now stiff. He tried to smile at the directors, but none met his eyes. Robert stood. "Before we begin," he said, "I'd like to address the leadership concerns raised after last night's events." Adrian cut in, voice sharp. "This is a personal matter. My private life has nothing to do with corporate performance." Ethan cleared his throat. "Actually, sir, it does. The falsified HR data and misuse of funds directly tie into your conduct." Adrian spun toward him. "You're siding with them?" "I'm siding with integrity," Ethan said simply. Grace entered then, quiet but unmissable. Every head turned. She took a seat beside Robert, folding her hands. Adrian froze. "You don't belong here," he muttered. "Neither does corruption," she replied. Robert slid the audit file across the table. "You can resign voluntarily, Adrian, or you can stay and watch every truth come out, one report at a time." Adrian's hand trembled. He looked around the table. No allies left. The silence crushed him. Finally, he signed the resignation form. The Mont Blanc pen clattered faintly against the glass table. Grace rose, voice soft but firm. "You once said power meant never apologizing. I think it's the opposite." He didn't look up, and as the board voted to accept his resignation, the sound of the gavel felt less like punishment, and more like the first honest breath the company had taken in years. The boardroom emptied slowly, leaving behind only echoes of whispered relief and the faint smell of espresso. Grace lingered by the window, watching the city hum beneath her. Yellow taxis slicing through Park Avenue traffic, the morning sun glinting off skyscrapers like gold on water. She had imagined this moment for months, yet it felt less like victory and more like release. Robert Sinclair stood across the room, arms crossed, silent as the skyline itself. His presence filled the space, steady, immovable. When he finally spoke, his voice was low but edged with something deeper than authority. "You did what needed to be done," he said. "Not many have the stomach for that." Grace turned to face him. "It doesn't feel like justice, Dad. It feels like loss." Robert nodded slowly. "Justice always feels like that to the people who still have hearts." He walked closer, studying her carefully. "You remind me of your mother tonight." Grace smiled faintly. "You mean stubborn?" He allowed the smallest grin. "Determined. She never walked away from truth, no matter how much it hurt. Neither have you." She looked down at her hands. "Do you think I went too far?" Robert exhaled. "Grace, when a man uses power to humiliate others, he forfeits his right to sympathy. You didn't destroy Adrian, you revealed him." There was silence between them, filled only by the distant hum of Manhattan. After a moment, Grace asked quietly, "What happens now?" "Now," Robert said, "we rebuild. Sinclair Capital will stabilize the company temporarily, then install an independent ethics committee. Ethan will take interim control. You'll need to decide what comes next for you." Grace blinked. "For me?" "You've spent years building someone else's dream," he said gently. "It's time to remember your own." She swallowed hard. "I don't even know who I am without the chaos." Robert stepped closer, his tone softening. "You're my daughter. That's a start." He placed a hand on her shoulder, firm, grounding. "I want you to know something," he said. "If you had chosen to walk away quietly, I would have understood. But you didn't. You stood in the fire and made them see you. That takes courage no business school can teach." Grace felt the sting of tears she had refused to shed all night. "I just didn't want to become bitter." "Bitterness comes from silence," Robert said. "You spoke. That's how you heal." A knock came at the door. It was Ethan. "Mr. Sinclair, the press is requesting a statement. They're waiting in the lobby." Robert nodded. "We'll be down shortly." As Ethan left, Grace turned back toward the window. "You're going to face the media?" Robert smirked lightly. "Someone has to protect the company's integrity. But make no mistake, tonight the story isn't about Adrian Cole. It's about what comes after him." Grace met his gaze. "And what about me?" Robert looked at her, eyes soft but serious. "You've already proven your strength. Now prove your peace. Don't live in the ruins, Grace. Build something new." She nodded slowly. "Maybe I'll finally go to Columbia." He smiled. "Your mother would like that." As they left the room, Grace glanced once more at the chair Adrian had occupied, the symbol of control now empty. It wasn't triumph she felt, but closure. Robert held the door open for her. "Ready?" Grace straightened her shoulders. Yes, but this time, I'm walking forward, not back. And as they stepped into the hallway filled with reporters and flashing lights, she realized her father wasn't just protecting her, he was passing her the torch. Night fell over Manhattan like a curtain of bruised velvet. The headlines had already crowned Grace the silent heroine and Adrian the fallen star. But the world's fascination with scandal never ends when the lights go out. It lingers, hungry for one more confession, one last act of desperation. In the penthouse that once symbolized success, Adrian Cole sat alone. The floor-to-ceiling windows reflected a ghost, his own. Half-empty bottles of Glenfiddich lined the counter, paper scattered across the marble floor. The city outside sparkled with indifference. The doorbell rang. Sophie Lang stood there, her face pale, her makeup minimal, her expression torn between guilt and resolve. She held a small Cartier box, the same one Adrian had once promised would seal their future. He blinked, surprised, voice rough from sleeplessness. "Sophie, what are you doing here?" "I came to give this back," she said simply, holding out the box. He stared at it, bitterness creeping into his tone. "You're really going to betray me too?" Sophie hesitated, then shook her head. "No, Adrian, you did that yourself," he laughed bitterly. "You think you're any different from Grace? She used me to make her father proud. You used me to climb the ladder. Don't pretend you were innocent." Tears welled in Sophie's eyes, but she stood her ground. "Maybe I wasn't, but at least I'm trying to fix it now." Adrian turned away, pacing toward the window. "Fix it? You've ruined me. They've frozen my accounts, stripped my position, dragged my name through every headline. What more do you want?" Sophie's voice steadied. "I want you to admit what you did, to me, to her, to everyone." He spun around. "You don't understand. I built this empire from nothing. I worked for every dollar, every headline. No one gave me a damn thing." Sophie stepped forward, trembling but fierce. "And in the process, you became the very thing you hated, a man who thinks power means ownership." For a moment, the silence between them was unbearable. Then she set the Cartier box on the table and whispered, "Grace offered me protection. She didn't have to. That's the difference between you and her." Adrian's jaw clenched. "Get out." She didn't move. "The investigators will call tomorrow. Tell them the truth, Adrian. Don't make this worse." He scoffed. "You think truth matters in this world?" "Yes," she said quietly, "because it's the only thing left when everything else burns." The front door opened again. Marcus Hale stepped in, his black suit immaculate, expression unreadable. "Mr. Cole," he said evenly, "I suggest you listen. Everything you've said tonight has been recorded for your protection and hers." Adrian froze. "You bugged me?" Marcus didn't flinch. "Grace wanted you to have a chance to speak freely before the investigators arrived. Consider it your last courtesy." Adrian's face hardened. "Tell her she's won." Marcus's voice dropped an octave. "This was never about winning." Sophie looked one last time at the man she'd once believed in. "Goodbye, Adrian." She turned and left, her heels echoing down the marble hallway. The door clicked shut. Adrian stood motionless, staring at the Cartier box. He opened it slowly. Inside, the engagement ring gleamed coldly beneath the dim light, untouched, unclaimed. Outside, sirens wailed faintly, blending with the hum of the city. For the first time, Adrian felt small, not because of the loss of power, but because the silence finally told him the truth. No one was coming to save him. And as the night swallowed the city, the man who thought he owned everything realized he had never truly owned anyone, not even himself. By dawn, the storm had reached Wall Street. What began as a scandal, whispered at a gala, had now become a full-blown financial meltdown. The giant ticker outside Cole Dynamics headquarters blinked red. Cole 8.9%. The numbers flickered like an open wound, bleeding across every screen from Times Square to Park Avenue. Inside the company's sleek glass tower, chaos reigned. Assistants darted between offices clutching printouts, phones rang non-stop, and anxious voices echoed down the corridors. Reporters had gathered on the sidewalk outside, shouting questions as cameras rolled. Ethan Reyes, now acting CEO, stood before the trading monitors with a jaw clenched so tightly it hurt. He had been through crises before, but never one this personal. Grace's calm, strategic words from the night before still echoed in his mind. Expose the truth, but protect the people. He straightened his tie and turned to his team. Freeze all external communications. Send a statement within the hour. Acknowledge the investigation, reaffirm our commitment to reform, and make it clear that this company will survive." His assistant hesitated. "Sir, the board wants to know if we should reach out to Mr. Cole for comment." Ethan's eyes hardened. "No. From this moment forward, Adrian Cole speaks only for himself." Meanwhile, Grace watched the live coverage from Robert's penthouse. The financial networks played the footage from the gala on repeat. The moment she placed the Tiffany box on the podium, the moment Robert announced the funding freeze, she looked at herself on the screen, detached, almost foreign. Robert entered the room with 2 cups of coffee. "It started," he said quietly. Grace nodded. "It had to." He handed her a mug. "You know the market. Panic comes first, recovery after. You can't stop the fall, but you can decide what rises from it." Grace smiled faintly. "I don't care about the stock, Dad. I care about the people inside that company who think this means they've failed." Robert studied her, pride glimmering in his eyes. "That's exactly why you're not like him." Across the city, Adrian sat in his office surrounded by silence and shattered ego. The ticker on his TV seemed to pulse like a heartbeat out of rhythm. He picked up his iPhone, scrolling through contacts. His lawyer, a few journalists, an old investor friend. But every name blurred together. No one was answering anymore. The door opened. It was Ethan. He stepped inside, posture firm. "Adrian." Adrian didn't turn. "Come to watch the show?" "I came to tell you I'm taking care of the staff," Ethan said evenly. "They deserve better than this chaos." Adrian laughed bitterly. "You think you can save them? You're naive." Ethan walked closer, lowering his voice. "No, I just believe leadership means owning the mess you make. Something you forgot." For a moment, the air between them was thick with old loyalty and new resentment. Adrian finally turned, eyes red-rimmed. "You'll regret siding with her." Ethan's expression didn't waver. "I didn't side with Grace. I sided with what's right." He left without another word. Outside, investors scrambled to protect their positions, analysts speculated, and Cole Dynamics stock tumbled past 10%. But within the storm, something remarkable happened. Employees began speaking out. Not in fear, but in relief. Anonymous messages poured into HR, thanking the board for taking action. Back at Robert's penthouse, Grace read the messages one by one. Her chest tightened, not with guilt, but with quiet vindication. Robert watched her silently, then said, "It's funny. You brought down a man and lifted 100 more." Grace looked out the window at the city glittering below. "No, Dad, I just gave them permission to breathe again." And as the market closed that evening with Cole Dynamics still bleeding red, Grace knew the numbers would recover. But her faith in herself already had. The next evening, the Plaza Hotel once again became a silent witness to the fall and rebirth of power. But this time, the ballroom lights were off. Only the presidential suite glowed, high above Fifth Avenue, where a confrontation waited to unfold. Inside, Robert Sinclair sat at a grand mahogany table, a stack of legal documents neatly arranged beside a Mont Blanc pen. Grace stood by the window, her reflection merging with the Manhattan skyline. The soft hum of the city below felt almost like a pulse, steady, inevitable. Adrian arrived 10 minutes late, wearing the same Armani suit from the board meeting. His tie was loosened, his eyes tired. Yet he still carried the same arrogance that once charmed investors and crushed opponents. "So," he said, forcing a smirk, "this is the part where you two decide how much of my company you want to steal." Robert didn't look up. "We're not stealing anything, Adrian. We're protecting what's left." Adrian scoffed. "What's left? You froze my accounts, took my seat, dragged my name through every tabloid in America. What else could you possibly want?" Grace turned slowly. Her voice was calm, deliberate. "Accountability." He laughed, but there was no joy in it. "You think this makes you noble? You embarrassed me in front of everyone. My employees, my board, my investors." "They weren't your audience," Grace interrupted quietly. "They were your victims." Robert finally spoke, sliding a document across the table. "This is a standstill agreement. You sign it, you step down temporarily as CEO, and you allow an independent ethics audit. In return, Sinclair Capital won't pursue civil damages." Adrian stared at the paper, incredulous. "You can't be serious." Robert's tone hardened. "I'm offering you dignity, Adrian. Don't mistake it for mercy." Grace folded her arms. "If you refuse, the Department of Labor will receive every HR file you buried, and the press will get your full email correspondence with Sophie Lang." Adrian's face went white. You wouldn't. I already did, Grace said. This is the only way left to end it quietly. The room fell silent. The ticking of the grandfather clock filled the space between their breaths. Adrian looked down at the Mont Blanc pen, its gold tip gleaming under the chandelier light. For a moment he considered walking out, burning it all down just to hurt her back. But then his eyes caught Grace's reflection in the window, calm, unflinching, untouchable. For the first time he understood he had already lost. He took the pen, his hand shaking slightly, and signed. The sound of ink scratching across paper felt heavier than any courtroom sentence. When he finished, Robert nodded once. You'll still have your shares, Adrian, but control? That's over. Adrian's eyes flicked to Grace. Was this revenge worth it? She shook her head. This wasn't revenge. This was closure. He laughed bitterly. You'll miss me when the silence gets too loud. Grace met his gaze, unwavering. No, I'll finally be able to hear myself think. Adrian pushed the papers toward Robert and stood. You two can have your victory. He turned for the door, but before leaving, he glanced back. You know, Grace, you could have ruined me completely. Why didn't you? She smiled faintly. Because I'm not you. The door closed behind him, echoing like a final gavel. Grace exhaled, shoulders trembling for the first time all night. Robert placed a hand on her back, proud but quiet. It's done. She looked at the signed papers, at the pen still glinting in the light. No, Dad, she whispered. It's just beginning. And as the city lights flickered across the suite, the empire Adrian once ruled began its new reign. Under honesty, not ego. 2 days after the meeting at the plaza, the city had moved on to a new scandal. But for Grace, the silence that followed was louder than any headline. She sat alone in her lawyer's office overlooking Central Park, the winter sunlight spilling across the conference table where a single document waited. The divorce papers. Nora Patel adjusted her glasses, watching her friend carefully. You don't have to do this today, she said softly. Grace exhaled. Yes, I do. I've delayed enough things in my life. Not this. The papers were immaculate, cold. Grace picked up the Mont Blanc pen Robert had given her after the board meeting. She turned it slowly in her hand, the ink glinting under the light. Do you want spousal support? Nora asked. Grace shook her head. No, I don't want his money. I just want peace. You're legally entitled to. I'm entitled to my dignity, Grace interrupted gently. That's enough. There was a quiet strength in her voice that even Nora couldn't challenge. Grace looked out the window. Central Park shimmered beneath a dusting of snow, people walking their dogs, couples holding hands. She used to imagine her life looking like that, warm, safe, steady. But maybe peace wasn't something you found in another person. Maybe it was something you built from the ashes. When the elevator chimed, Adrian walked in. His suit was still sharp, but his face had aged years and days. The man who once owned every room now seemed like he was struggling to breathe in one. Grace, he said quietly, you couldn't even wait a week? Grace didn't turn. I waited 5 years, Adrian. He sighed and sank into the chair across from her. You really won't take a cent? She looked at him then, eyes clear, voice steady. I don't need anything from you. The only thing I ever wanted was respect. And you spent years proving you couldn't afford it. Adrian rubbed his temples, frustration and regret mixing in his expression. I made mistakes, yes, but everything I did, everything, was to keep the company alive. Grace leaned forward. No, Adrian, you kept your ego alive. The company was collateral. For the first time, he didn't argue. The fight had drained out of him. He reached for the papers. His hand trembled. You'll really walk away from all of it? From the name, the wealth, the house, everything? Grace smiled faintly. I walked away the night you forgot who I was. He looked at her, eyes glassy with something between pain and admiration. You were always stronger than I gave you credit for. I know, she said simply. She slid the pen toward him. Your turn. He signed, the sound of ink scratching across the page echoing in the stillness. When it was done, he placed the pen down and stared at his signature like it belonged to a stranger. Grace picked up her copy, folded it carefully, and slipped it into her purse. I'm not angry anymore, she said quietly. I thought I would be, but I'm not. Anger kept me standing when I had nothing else. But now, I don't need it. Adrian looked at her one last time. Do you ever think we could have been different? She hesitated, then nodded. Maybe, if you'd loved me half as much as you loved control. She rose to leave. The light from the window wrapped around her like closure itself. At the door, she paused and turned slightly. "Goodbye, Adrian. Take care of yourself," he whispered. "You already did." And as the elevator doors closed, Grace realized she wasn't walking away from a marriage. She was walking toward her freedom. That night, the city outside Grace's penthouse was draped in quiet. Central Park shimmered below, half asleep under the New York snow. For the first time in years, the apartment didn't smell like Adrian's cologne or the sharp sting of stress. It smelled like jasmine tea and clean air. Grace sat by the window, wearing her mother's old wool sweater, bare feet tucked under her. The divorce had been finalized that morning. One signature, and half a decade of her life became a legal file. Yet there was no triumph, no bitterness, just stillness. Her phone buzzed on the coffee table. Messages from journalists, well-wishers, even strangers calling her the woman who exposed a titan. She turned the phone face down. She didn't need validation from headlines. Tonight wasn't about power. It was about healing. Grace reached into a small drawer and took out her mother's vintage Rolex, the one that had ticked through every generation of Sinclair women. She wound it gently, listening to the soft click of gears coming back to life. For years, she had stopped hearing her own rhythm. Now, it was coming back. She rose and walked into the study, where a box sat unopened on the desk. It was the same one she'd ignored for months, her deferred admission package from Columbia University. The edges were slightly worn, the seal half torn. She opened it carefully, fingers trembling. Inside was the letter she knew by heart. "We're pleased to confirm your acceptance into the MBA program, deferred 1 year. Please notify us by March 1st if you intend to enroll." March 1st. 2 weeks away. Grace smiled softly. She picked up a pen and began drafting her response. For the first time, the idea of the future didn't scare her. Her thoughts drifted to Adrian, alone now, probably surrounded by lawyers and regret. A small part of her still hoped he'd learn something from the wreckage. But that wasn't her burden anymore. The only person she needed to save now was herself. A knock at the door startled her. When she opened it, Robert Sinclair stood there, holding 2 Starbucks cups and a small bag of takeout. "You didn't eat dinner," he said simply, walking in without waiting. Grace laughed. "I'm 30, Dad, not 13. "Doesn't matter," he said, setting the food down. "Even generals eat after battle." They sat together at the table, the hum of the city outside like background music. Robert studied her quietly. "You seem lighter," he said. Grace nodded. "I feel lighter." He smiled faintly. "Your mother used to say peace is what's left after truth does its job." Grace sipped her coffee. "Then truth worked overtime this week." They both laughed softly. After dinner, Robert stood to leave but paused by the door. "Grace," he said, his tone more tender than usual. "Your mother's foundation has been dormant for years. If you want to restart it, education, women in leadership, whatever direction you choose, I'll fund it. Think of it as your next chapter." Her eyes glistened. "You'd really do that?" "You've earned it," he said simply. When he left, Grace sat again by the window. The Rolex ticked on her wrist, steady and sure. Across the street, the lights of Fifth Avenue blinked like small affirmations. She opened her laptop and began sketching out a proposal. Sinclair Fellowship for Women in Leadership. The idea flowed like oxygen. For the first time, her future wasn't attached to anyone else's name. Outside, the first flakes of snow began to fall again. Soft, quiet, forgiving. Grace whispered to herself, "This time it's mine." And as the night deepened, the woman who had once lived in the shadow of a man began to rise, not as a survivor, but as her own beginning. 2 weeks later, a new dawn broke over Manhattan, and for Cole Dynamics, it wasn't just another business day. It was the start of a reckoning. The company's gleaming glass tower on Fifth Avenue no longer bore Adrian's presence. His nameplate had been removed, his office sealed. But inside the building, a cautious energy buzzed. For the first time in years, employees walked in not with fear, but with curiosity. Ethan Rise stood at the front of the main auditorium, adjusting his tie nervously. As interim CEO, he looked more like a professor than a power figure, yet his voice carried steady authority when he spoke. "We're not here to erase our past," he began, "but to rebuild what it broke. From this day forward, no one in this company should feel small enough to be silent." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. HR leaders, engineers, designers, all listening, many for the first time truly believing that the culture might change. Grace sat quietly in the back row, wearing a soft gray coat, her hair pinned loosely. She hadn't wanted to attend, but Ethan insisted. "You started this," he had said. "You deserve to see it evolve." On stage, he unveiled a new initiative, Integrity First. The phrase glowed across the screen behind him, accompanied by a bold tagline, "Leadership is service." Under it were real reforms, anonymous reporting lines, mentorship programs for women, flexible work hours, and a partnership with Columbia's business ethics department. Grace felt a lump rise in her throat. This wasn't revenge, this was redemption. When the applause began, she slipped out quietly, heading toward the executive floor. The space was eerily quiet, like a museum after closing. Adrian's old office door stood ajar, the air still faintly scented with cedar and arrogance. She stepped inside. The walls were bare, no portraits, no awards, no trace of him. But on the desk, she found something unexpected, a small leather notebook. Inside were scribbled ideas, new strategies, marketing pitches, and a few raw lines written in Adrian's unmistakable handwriting. "I built an empire and lost the only person who believed in me." She closed the book gently, not with pity, but with understanding. For all his flaws, Adrian had been human, and that humanity, warped, neglected, was the same thing she was trying to restore in the company he left behind. "Grace?" Ethan's voice came from the doorway. She turned. "You're doing a good job," she said softly. He smiled, looking almost embarrassed. "I'm just trying not to crash the ship you helped steer back to shore." Grace chuckled. "You won't. You actually listen." They walked together to the lobby, where the new company plaque gleamed on the wall. Coal Dynamics, rebuilt on trust. The employees exiting the meeting smiled as they passed, some nodding at Grace in quiet gratitude. Outside, the afternoon sunlight hit the Fifth Avenue glass facade just right, turning the company's logo into a prism of color. Grace paused, feeling warmth spread through her chest. Ethan glanced at her. "You're leaving for Columbia soon, aren't you?" She nodded. "Next month. But I'll stay connected. This place deserves a better legacy." He grinned. "You already gave it one." As she stepped out onto the street, the wind carried the faint hum of traffic and laughter from nearby cafes. The chaos that once defined her life had faded into balance. The city didn't feel cruel anymore. It felt alive. Grace looked up at the tower one last time, her reflection merging with the skyline. "He built a company," she whispered, "but we built a future." And as she walked down Fifth Avenue toward her next chapter, the empire that once silenced her was finally learning to speak with integrity. By the following month, the story had traveled far beyond New York. Business journals called it the Plaza Redemption. Ethics professors dissected it in classrooms, and for once, a corporate scandal ended not in ruin, but in reflection. Grace Sinclair's name had become synonymous with quiet power, not vengeance. Yet fame was never what she wanted. She wanted understanding. Closure. On a crisp spring morning, she sat at a small corner table at a cafe near Columbia University, sipping her latte and reviewing lecture notes. The scent of roasted coffee and rain lingered in the air. She was no longer Mrs. Adrian Cole. She was Grace Sinclair again, a name she was finally proud to carry alone. Across from her sat a journalist from the Wall Street Ledger, recording device discreetly placed between them. "Grace," the reporter said gently, "your story has inspired thousands of women in business to speak up. How do you feel about that?" Grace smiled modestly. "I didn't set out to inspire anyone. I just stopped lying to myself. The rest followed." "But do you think what you did changed corporate culture?" She paused, swirling her coffee. "Change doesn't start with companies," she said softly. "It starts with conversations. It starts with one person deciding silence is no longer an option." The journalist nodded, clearly moved. "And Adrian Cole, have you spoken to him since the investigation closed?" Grace hesitated. "No, I heard he left New York. I hope he finds peace, in his own way." In truth, she'd seen the news. Adrian had sold his shares, donated a portion to an education fund, and quietly disappeared to Europe. That was enough for her. Closure didn't need confrontation. After the interview, Grace walked through the campus, her notebook tucked under her arm. Students rushed past, laughing, planning futures. She smiled. She remembered what it felt like to believe the world was still moldable. She found a quiet bench under a budding cherry tree and sat down. Her phone buzzed. A message from Ethan. Audit results cleared. We're officially certified as a transparent company. Employees voted to rename our mentorship fund after you, the Sinclair Initiative. Grace stared at the message, emotions catching in her throat. She typed back, "Don't name it after me, just keep it alive." She put the phone away, leaning back as sunlight filtered through pink petals. Later that afternoon, she visited the River Cafe in Brooklyn, the same place where she once had dinner with her father during the darkest period of her marriage. Now she walked in with lighter steps. Robert was already waiting by the window, reading the Financial Times. He looked up and smiled. "You've been busy changing the world again, haven't you?" Grace laughed. "Not changing, just cleaning up the mess we left behind." They shared dinner. No boardrooms, no tension, just warmth. Between bites, Robert said, "You know, the board voted unanimously to support the fellowship program. Sinclair Capital is funding it under your leadership." Her eyes widened. "Mine? Who else?" he said proudly. "It's time for you to lead something that doesn't demand you to sacrifice yourself." For once, Grace didn't argue. "Then I'll do it," she said softly, "but only if it stays true to what it started from, truth and empathy." Robert raised his glass. "To truth, then." They clinked glasses gently. The evening sun painted the Brooklyn Bridge gold, reflections rippling across the river. As she looked out over the skyline, Grace felt something she hadn't in years. Not victory, not relief, but harmony. Everything that had fallen apart had rearranged itself into something better. And when night descended over Manhattan, the woman who once stood alone under the chandeliers of humiliation was now the quiet voice echoing across boardrooms, a reminder that truth, once spoken, never fades. It had been 6 months since the gala, the night everything fell apart and somehow fell into place. Summer had come to New York, painting the skyline gold and lavender, but inside the polished marble halls of the Manhattan family court, the air was still heavy, echoing with footsteps, verdicts, and the sound of endings. Grace sat quietly in the courtroom, wearing a cream suit and no jewelry except her mother's vintage Rolex. Across the aisle, Adrian sat alone, looking smaller than she remembered. No assistants, no entourage, no arrogance. Just a man stripped of armor. Judge Lawson entered, flipping through the case file. "Final hearing on the matter of Cole versus Cole," he announced. "All terms agreed?" Nora Patel, seated beside Grace, nodded. "Yes, Your Honor. Both parties have settled privately. No contest." Adrian spoke softly. "That's correct." The judge glanced at the paperwork. "Mr. Cole, you are relinquishing all joint property and financial claims. Mrs. Sinclair, you're waiving alimony. Are you certain?" Grace met the judge's gaze. "I'm certain." The pen scraped paper. The final stamp landed with a heavy thud, an ending disguised as paperwork. Judge Lawson smiled faintly. "Then I wish both of you peace. Court is adjourned." Grace exhaled quietly. It was over. As she stood to leave, Adrian approached her slowly. The years of ambition that once clung to him were gone, replaced by something raw and human. "Grace," he said, voice breaking slightly, "thank you for not destroying me completely. You could have." She met his eyes, calm but not cold. "I didn't need to. You're doing the rebuilding yourself." He gave a weak laugh. "I heard about the Sinclair Fellowship. That's impressive. You're helping women find their voices." She smiled faintly. "Someone has to. We've both seen what silence costs." He hesitated, as if wanting to say more, then nodded. "Goodbye, Grace. Goodbye, Adrian." And just like that, the two people who once built an empire together walked away from each other. Not in anger, but in quiet recognition that some things can't be fixed, only understood. Outside the courthouse, the late afternoon sun spilled over the steps. Robert Sinclair waited near a black Mercedes, leaning on his cane. When he saw his daughter, he straightened, his eyes softening. "It's done?" he asked. Grace nodded. "Completely." He handed her a folder. "These are the final approvals for the fellowship. You'll present it at the River Cafe next week. The press will be there. Be ready." Grace smiled. "For once, I think I am." As they drove down Park Avenue, Grace looked out the window at the city she once feared and now loved again. New York had a way of humbling you, of breaking and rebuilding in the same breath. It mirrored her perfectly. When they stopped at a light, she saw a woman crossing the street with a briefcase and a baby carrier. Grace's chest tightened. Not with sadness, but empathy. She understood that balance now, the weight of ambition, the price of love, the strength it took to keep walking anyway. Robert glanced at her. "What are you thinking?" She smiled softly. "That endings aren't always about loss. Sometimes they're just the universe saying, 'Now you're ready.'" He nodded approvingly. "Then you're ready." Later that night, Grace stood on her balcony overlooking Central Park. The city lights sparkled like the chandelier that had witnessed her humiliation months ago, but this time they didn't mock her. They saluted her. She whispered into the warm summer breeze, "I forgive you, Adrian, and I forgive myself." And in that single act of grace, the last shadow of her past lifted, leaving behind not a victim, not even a survivor, but a woman finally whole. 7 months after the gala, the city that once witnessed Grace's humiliation now gathered to celebrate her rebirth. The evening sun glowed like molten gold across the East River, reflecting on the glass walls of the River Cafe beneath the Brooklyn Bridge. Inside, the room buzzed with soft music, camera flashes, and murmurs of admiration. Tonight marked the launch of the Sinclair Fellowship for Women in Leadership, a scholarship and mentorship foundation built on the ashes of her pain. Business leaders, journalists, professors, and young women filled the elegant dining room, sipping champagne as the skyline shimmered outside. Grace stood near the floor-to-ceiling window, wearing a sleek white gown that whispered strength, not vanity. On her wrist, her mother's Rolex gleamed faintly beneath the soft light. She held a simple Mont Blanc pen in her hand, the same one she'd used to sign her divorce papers, now repurposed to sign new beginnings. Robert Sinclair approached, his tuxedo impeccable, pride shining through his usual stoicism. "Full house," he said with a rare smile. "You've done it, Grace." She turned to him, eyes soft. "We've done it. You believed in me when I couldn't." He squeezed her hand. "Your mother would have been proud. She always said the world changes one woman's courage at a time." The host tapped the microphone, and the chatter faded. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced, "please welcome the founder of the Sinclair Fellowship, Ms. Grace Sinclair." Applause filled the air as Grace stepped onto the stage. The skyline glittered behind her, Manhattan glowing like a memory she'd finally made peace with. She paused before speaking, letting the silence settle. "A year ago," she began, "I stood in a ballroom much like this one. The chandeliers sparkled, the music played. But that night, I learned something. Glamour fades fast when truth walks into the room." Soft laughter rippled through the audience. "I was humiliated publicly, yes, but that moment gave me something more powerful than reputation. It gave me clarity. I realized how many women stay silent in the face of disrespect, believing it's safer to shrink than to speak. I was one of them. Until I wasn't." Her voice strengthened. The Sinclair Fellowship was born from that silence, from every woman who thought she had to endure in order to belong. I want them to know, endurance is not weakness. Speaking up is not rebellion, it's leadership. Applause broke out again, warm and genuine. Grace smiled, emotion glistening in her eyes. "I don't stand here as a victim or even as a survivor. I stand here as proof that healing is possible, and that power built on truth doesn't destroy, it restores." She looked at the front row where Ethan Rise sat with the new Coal Dynamics leadership team. They nodded respectfully. The company had changed, rebuilt itself under the very values she had once fought for. When the applause faded, Robert joined her on stage, handing her a small velvet box. Inside was a delicate Cartier bracelet, her mother's. "It's time this came home," he whispered. Grace's eyes filled. She clasped it around her wrist and turned back to the crowd. "This bracelet once belonged to a woman who believed in grace through strength. I finally understand what she meant." The audience rose to their feet. Cameras flashed. The skyline behind her gleamed brighter than ever, as if New York itself was acknowledging her journey. Later that night, as the guests departed and the music softened, Grace stepped out onto the terrace. The breeze from the East River carried the faint hum of the city she loved, the same city that had once broken her and then built her again. She whispered to the night, "I'm not afraid anymore." The lights of Manhattan blinked in silent agreement. And as the river flowed beneath the bridge, Grace Sinclair, once the wife behind a man's empire, became the architect of her own legacy, proving that the truest revenge is not destruction, but rebirth. So, that's how the story ends. Grace's journey wasn't just about betrayal or revenge, it was about rediscovering herself after losing everything. And if you're still here, listening until this moment, maybe something inside you is whispering too. Maybe this story touched a place in your heart that still believes in second chances. You see, healing doesn't happen when everything is perfect. It begins when we finally stop pretending. Like Marcus Aurelius once wrote, you have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. That's what Grace learned. The power to rebuild starts within. Not from revenge, but from release. Life will always test us. People will betray, disappoint, and misunderstand. But every ending, if faced with truth, becomes a beginning. And you, yes, you watching this right now, carry that same strength Grace found. The courage to start again. If this story moved you, if it reminded you of your own resilience, please like this video, share it with someone who needs hope tonight, and don't forget to subscribe. Because here, we tell stories that don't just end, they heal.